If you will give up a Saturday morning like this to be here, then you really need to be here. I want to first thank Barataji for allowing me to crash his normal group, and I hope you all will forgive me, and hopefully he'll have time to make up for the lost session. I have no idea. All right. All right. Also, I want to thank those of you who have been going through the anger management with Barataji for hanging in there. Anger management is a kind of phenomena that can cause a great deal of discomfort because it usually teases out your ego mythology and exposes you at the level that you're at. And that's never a comfortable ordeal. So I commend you for hanging in there. And Barataji, I hope you've been very gentle in your surgery, huh? If he hasn't, give me a call, huh? Well, for the time that we have here today, I thought I would stand the anger dharma, anger management, and the psychology of anger management within this larger context. Anger management is simply an excerpt of a much more comprehensive model for attaining psychological and emotional health and well-being. This larger model, of which anger management is an excerpt, is really about emotional self-management. Development. So we're going to be talking about that whole range, that whole process. Now, how many in here are therapists? Let me see who's in here. All right, therapists here. How many counselors, guidance counselors? All right, teachers? Good. Any physicists? No physicists, all right, so we can't do quantum mechanics today, huh? All right. Okay. Anybody in the medical field? All right. Well, I'm asking these questions because what we're going to discuss today will be pertaining to everything. Everything that it means to be human will be briefly touched upon today. So when we're talking about emotional self-management and development, well, we're talking about the implications of emotional development in every aspect of human existence, in every aspect of human relationships. After all, when we talk about this thing, we're talking about how the emotions, how your emotions themselves drive your physical well-being, your mental well-being, and your spiritual well-being. All of these are driven by your emotions. That's why today there's a lot more emphasis in the culture of psychiatry and psychology on the role of emotions. Those sciences now are focusing their attention on that. And so you find that the kind of research that is going on pertaining to the fields of neuroscience and neurology and so forth and so on is focusing in on your emotions, because your emotion plays a major, major role in your experience of well-being at the level of your body, psychologically and spiritually. Before we plunge into the subject, let me get comfortable. You do the same. You take your shoes off. You get sleepy, go to sleep. Just don't snore. We don't want that on film. And let's see if we can make some sense out of this here. You have a black one, beloved? All right, good. Just in case you're wondering about the stick, those who don't understand, I will use this to knock some sense in your head, all right? I come totally prepared here today. All right. So before we plunge into this discussion, let us pause for a moment and consider some of the effects that your emotions have across the entire spectrum of your being. And of course, those of you who are in the business should have insights into this relationship to begin with. What are some of the effects that your unmanaged emotions have on you physically, mentally, and spiritually? Now, before we start unpacking that, let me remind you that when we talk about emotional self-management, we're talking about the management of the entire realm of those negative emotions when failed to be managed will impact upon the body-mind system in a negative way. So when we're talking about unmanaged emotions, we're talking about anger. You all have talked a little bit about that, right? We're talking about lust. We're talking about greed. We're talking about attachment. And we're talking about vanity. I'm going to say a lot more about all of these, particularly vanity, the psychological illusion of being unique. It's an illusion. All right? That's the first thing you need to understand. That's what makes vanity such a difficult emotional condition to work with, to overcome. You see, long after you have got some degree of control over your anger, your lust, your greed, your attachment, all that really do is now fuels your vanity. Because now you think that you really something great because you've been able, you see, to make some progress in those areas. So this vanity, this psychological illusion of being unique, of being separate, of being independent from others is a big one, okay? Now, what I am suggesting to you, beloved, is that all of these negative emotional states, when you don't know how to manage them, when your emotional self-management ability is low, it will become obvious as we go along in this discussion today that the vast majority of us have very low emotional management skills. You may do a self-assessment by looking at the degree of misery you're experiencing. What the Buddha called dukkha. Where there's dukkha, there's emotional illiteracy. Now, with that said, and we'll come back to some of that later, let us begin to outline what are some of the effects that unmanaged emotions have on us at the level of the physical. How does that impact our physical well-being? What happens to the body as a result of your inability to manage your emotions? Oxygen deprivation and all of that. Yeah, all of those vital systems, right, are diminished in some respect. Sleep disorder, all of that. One of the most telltale signs of all of that can be summarized in the word stress. Is that about right? In fact, 85 to 95% of all illnesses that are presented in hospitals are stress-based. Please make a note. Stress-based. Over 90% of the people going to see doctors are really displaying symptoms that are really associated with that individual's inability to handle stress. Your stress quotient is directly related to your own ability to manage your emotions, okay? The inability to manage your own emotions increases your experience of stress. Are you with me so far? Make sense so far? Okay. Because I want you to understand the etiology of stress. Stress is not coming from the outside. The stress you experience is a reflection of where you are at in terms of your own emotional self-management development. And this stress now has a negative impact at the level of the body. It is a part of so many of the kinds of symptoms that is presented to physicians, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Those things, Pujaji, that you were just mentioning, right? Mm-hmm. And we won't exhaust it now, we'll come back to it a little bit later. Mentally, psychologically. In fact, almost every psychological disorder that you can think of can be ultimately reduced to an emotional deficit, an emotional weakness. Therapists, please make a note of it. Almost all of the psychological problems people present in therapy are a reflection of that individual's lack of emotional self-management skills. Hmm? And that can manifest in all kinds of things, can't it? Depression, right? What else? Yeah, obsession. What else? Panic disorder, anxiety attack, psychosis, chronic worrying, blah, 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 blah. You know the DSM. You can make your own list. Right? Is there some water here, beloved? I have some somewhere. Again, emotions. Now, to appreciate the impact of this, because sometimes it takes a while for this stuff to sink in. But you must hear my arguments and hear them clearly and permit them to sink deeply within you, to the point of revelation. Don't address it merely as information. Information does not transform anybody. It's understanding, and you must really understand why you feel the way you feel. Now, you have to really understand something. How many are familiar with performance curves? Are you familiar with? All right. Well, you know, like in a performance curve, here you have a task that you have assigned for yourself. And as you start moving toward the fulfillment of that task, you start making effort, right? It requires effort, right? Energy. And as you move closer to the task, you're expending more energy, right? Emotional, psychological, physical, etc. Here I'm talking about the emotional component of that process. Now, as you move more and more towards your task, it's going to require more and more emotional resilience. Is that about right? People that have chronic stress are usually individuals who don't have emotional resilience. They are emotionally weak. Okay? So as they pursue the fulfillment of a task, and all tasks are going to require a certain amount of energy / stress, you got to have that. As they approximate that, they reach a point where they run out of emotional energy. Literally. Sometimes it's not physical. I mean, you're strong enough, you're healthy enough at the body, but you're weak emotionally. You can't make the rest of the distance because you become what? Depressed, discouraged, frustrated, you know the rest, right? And you fail ultimately, don't you? Because you ran out of emotional energy. You did not have the requisite amount of emotional energy that the task before you required. And whenever you find that you are confronted with a task that exceeds your ability to cope with it, you tend to either attack and try to destroy the thing, we'll talk about that later, or you withdraw from it. The usual individual will withdraw. Then they will rationalize their withdrawal. I didn't want the damn grapes. They're probably not sweet anyway. I was just wasting my time. Blah, 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 blah. But the reality is that this individual simply ran out of emotional energy. What occurred in them is what we call in the business homeostasis depletion. They became depleted. Now, what happens if you keep pushing that individual toward the fulfilling of the task, like in the Army? Well, you got that top sergeant. He don't give a damn whether you got emotional resiliency or not. You're going to go through all those obstacles on that course of training. Is that about right? You're going to get out there and get your M16 and get your ass out there, right? Well, that individual has already exceeded their own capacity to handle the stress associated with that task. So what'll happen here is that they'll start declining, won't they? What they'll start doing is mentally and psychologically, and of course in some cases physically, deteriorating. And they will reach a point of complete crisis and breakdown. In fact, if they descend beyond this point of crisis, they come closer and closer to death. It'll kill them. It'll kill them. So, when we're talking about your abilities to manage your own emotions and those negative emotional states, what we're really talking about is a matter of the absolute quality of your life. In our culture, we tend to put all the emphasis on the standard of life. So you're working all these jobs, buying all these things, buying all these cars, clothes, and blah, 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 because you somehow think that life is about the standard of life. You have no concept of the quality of life. You don't even know how to make your life quality. That's why you're buying all this shit in the first place, because you really don't know how to really create quality life and live it. That requires emotional intelligence, and you don't have any of that. So I really want you to understand here what the consequences are of our refusal to really take these arguments seriously and really look into dealing with ways by which we can enhance our abilities to manage our own negative emotions. All right, let us return to our quick overview. And all of this is quick. Obviously, today, I cannot exhaust any of this. I'm just here to whet your appetite. And I'll leave the rest to Brother G. So you should have a big anger management group next time, huh? All right. Spiritually, how does all this impact upon you spiritually? What are the spiritual implications of your inability to manage your own emotional conditions? Have you ever thought about it? What role does emotional resilience play in your own spiritual ambitions? Now, you either want to be a good Christian or a good Muslim or a good this or a good that. Those are sort of spiritual goals, aren't they? How many of you got spiritual goals for yourself? All right. Well, to reach those spiritual goals, you're going to have to go through a performance curve, aren't you? Is that about right? Is that right? Now, of all of the tests of life and goals that you can set for yourself, none will require more emotional resilience and ability to cope with stress than the spiritual test. That's why most people are not religious. They're anti-religious because they're not fools. They know shit. Ain't nowhere in the world I can do this. This is too much. You follow me? For me to move my life toward fulfilling the requirements to be a Christian beyond the level of rhetoric, or to be a Muslim beyond the level of rhetoric, or to be a yogi beyond the level of rhetoric, or to be a mystic or Hindu or a Buddhist or whatever your spiritual task or goal in life is, you know deep down inside of you, that's the big one. That is the great work. All right? Everything else is in descending orders in terms of requiring emotional resilience. And so what happened, full of your gleefulness after reading some books and scriptures and so forth and so on, you embark upon the spiritual journey. One of the things for those of you who are connected with the House of Ra have heard me say since the first time you got around me was this sadhana, which is just a Hindu term for the spiritual practice associated with achieving your spiritual goal. Sadhana, what, folks? Hurts. It takes everything of a man and woman to fulfill authentic spiritual goal, and I mean everything. Everything. And the reality is that most people don't have the emotional resilience required for achieving much in the way of spiritual development. Those of you who are involved in such a journey, then you already know. Here's your spiritual goal, which is usually expressed in the term enlightenment, right? Or God realization, or self-realization, so forth and so on. It's your goal. You get started practicing. That's the meditation and all that is associated with sadhana, right? And what happens to your energy here? Peter out, right? So after about 3 months on the path, you whoop. Shit. And from this point on, you're in a downward spiral, and you're just looking for alternatives to sadhana. There are no alternatives to sadhana at all. You see? It takes what it takes. You see? It takes what it takes. And so what you'll do, you will quickly find out and get a feedback and a direct self-assessment of your own emotional quotient, your own capacity to deal with stress that is the result of the ordeal associated with spiritual development. Because won't that bring some stress in your life? It's going to impact in your personal relationship, isn't it? Your husband or wife don't want you up in the morning at 3 o'clock doing no meditation. They want you in that bed next to them. You follow me? And they don't understand this bizarre diet that you are practicing. They want you to get some Kentucky Fried Chicken. And you understand there's always stress in that relationship. Even when both people are on the path, there's still stress. You follow what I'm saying? It is just a stressful situation. Since every task requires a certain amount of energy, is that about right? I mean, even from a scientific model now, we can justify the argument about the necessity for developing emotional resilience. It is a kind of biopsychic energy that certain tasks that you set for yourself in life requires. There's a physics about it. It can be expressed mathematically and so forth and so on. What I'm really suggesting to you again is that goals takes what they take. So pause for a moment. Examine some of the goals you got for yourself. It doesn't matter what arena they are in, whether they are spiritual, worldly, it doesn't matter. Because don't worldly goals also require a certain amount of energy and resilience? Sure they do. You get a vision for some possibility for your life and living, perhaps other than the pursuit of God realization. You come up with something else that you are willing to devote your life to, whatever that may be. You get that vision. Then you embark. But what you find out, you don't even have the kind of patience and tolerance that is required to fulfill that particular goal. You want to get rich overnight. So you move through endless scams because you don't have patience. You don't have tolerance. Those are aspects of a higher emotional state of being. And you don't have that. And so you tend to jump from one thing to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, chasing visions, but never attaining the goals of any of your visions. This is how you spend your life. Always missing, and then looking for the next. We'll talk about that a little later. Are you all right so far? Because I want to crank it up a little bit. Will that be all right? All right. because there's so much to say here. But I just want you to get some kind of sense of where we're going here. Now that you have a better understanding of the vital role that emotions and emotional energy play in every aspect of your life and living, we might as well begin to look and see how all this stuff looks in very plain, simple language. Now, we're going to have to talk a little bit about the brain. A little bit. And the reason why is because there is a great myth about developing your brain as the principal means by which you can achieve all of these wonderful goals that you set for yourself. I go get some more degrees, blah, 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 blah. So you got to understand something about the brain. And then we'll be able to enter into a deeper level of this discussion. Of course, I'm no artist, so you got to live with me. This is supposed to be the cortex, okay? Let's call this the limbic. And let's call this the brainstem. Because we want to talk about what role do the brain play in determining your own emotional level of development. What role does the brain itself play in that? What part of the brains are involved in your emotions? What are the sources of it? All these questions now confront anybody that becomes serious about it now. And for centuries, you see, emotions were not even considered to be associated with the brain. They were considered associated with the heart. Interesting. If you notice in ancient Kemetic religion, spirituality, mysticism, if you look in the hieroglyphics, if you know something about that culture, they always talked about at the end of life, what happens in the halls of Ma'at? What is put on those scales? The heart. The condition of your heart. And for thousands of years prior to the rise of modern science, it was always understood that it is the heart that drives the emotions. That's very interesting, isn't it? That's very interesting. Because today, beloved, what I'm going to be talking to you principally about is how to cultivate the heart brain. How to cultivate the heart brain. How to open your heart. How to access the intelligence of your heart. If you're going to try to live your life, if you're going to try to potentiate your human possibilities strictly by dealing with the brain, you're not going to make it. The brain was not even intended to provide you with the capacity to realize your totality and possibilities. She's having a good time, see. She's not like her brain is not interfering with anything, see. Except for Bilal. Now, this is a little tedious here, so I'm going to try to do this as simply as I can. But today there's a new branch of medical research that has emerged called neurocardiology, a kind of marriage between neuroscience and cardiology. Something very interesting that happened back in the 80s. First thing that happens that in 1983, the heart was discovered to be more than just some lump of meat pumping blood. It was discovered that the heart also is really technically a part of the endocrine system. It creates hormones. We're going to get into all of that. So the heart itself was reclassified. That got people's attention in the scientific community on the end of research. About 1985, over in Belgium, in a Belgian hospital, it just so happened that the neurology and the cardiology departments were on the same floor. So these doctors would meet during coffee break and so forth, and so on, they'll kick it. You know what I mean? It was a research institute, and they would share each other's research. And they began to discover the correlation and the relationship between the brain and the heart. We had always thought that the brain really determined all of the activity that is associated with the heart, because that's the prevailing model. That's what people who are still operating off of knowledge about these matters prior to 1983, that's where they stuck at. And that's most of your medical profession, incidentally. The prevailing assumption is that the brain controls the heart. The reality is the other way around. And it's almost common sense. Because when you, even embryonically speaking now, folks, when this baby was developing, if you look at a fetus inside the mother's womb, if you look at the body, you will find that the largest part of that body is the heart. You just got a little hit. It's the heart. The heart is about 80% of the body of the fetus. Heart beating developed before the brain. Are you got me now? The heart is beating before the brain even begins to grow. In fact, right now, you can cut your head open, pull the brain out, and the heart is continue to beat. What they discovered is that the heart produces its own life force, independent of the brain. Secondly, that the heart has its own nervous system. Okay? What they found out, folks, was that the heart is really a brain. Now, I don't have time to go into all of that, but even if you look at the heart, you'll find 70% of those cells that make up the heart are the same kinds of cells that make up the brain. You'll find that there's some 40,000 plus neurons in the heart. The heart makes hormones. It's way out. We'll get a little bit of it. We'll see if we have time today. But I just want to have you understand here that you can't really develop yourself emotionally, intellectually. That's my point, ultimately. You can't get there from there. Yes, the neocortex will give you the ability to use your intellect, but your intellect cannot control your emotions. Has there been anybody experienced otherwise? Huh? Can't do it. You try, beloved? Shuts down. Because the intellect is not in charge of the emotions. Heart is the seat. And therefore, when we talk about emotional self-management development, what I'm really talking to you about is cultivating the heart. Learning how to cultivate the intelligence of your heart. The seat of intelligence is not in the brain. You're trying to become intelligent by working in your brain, developing your intellect more, reading more books, studying, coming to more places like this, thinking that the more information I get, blah, 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 the more intelligent I become. You will never become intelligent like that because that's intelligence. The seat of intelligence is not even in the brain. It's not even in the neocortex. It's not even involved in any of those neural fields. The seat of intelligence is in the heart. It is the prior intelligence. Are you able to really understand me? Let's look at the biology of the relationship just a little bit more, because upon this understanding depends the rest of what I have to say to you. If you don't get this, you're not going to get the rest of this conversation we're having today. It's going to be over your head. And that simply means that I'm really going to have to use this stick, huh? Now, after the heart is developed, because that's the first thing that gets developed, the heart. Then, the next part of the brain that gets developed after the heart gets developed is the R complex, the brain stem, the reticular brain. Anybody know what that brain does? That's the most primitive brain, right? What does the reticular complex do? What actions are associated with it? Survival. Yeah, it deals with your survival, right? Your reflexes. Mm-hmm. That's right. Sex. That's right. Food, hunger, that kind of a thing. Rest, right? Very basic brain. You follow me? Very basic stuff. That's the first brain that evolved, right? It's the brain of the reptilian, the snake brain. That's why they call it the reptilian complex. The ancient Africans represented that with the snake, and you all know that, so I'm not going to go into all of that argument. But it houses that kind of behavior. It is the source of that kind of behavior, right? It deals in aversion and attraction, don't it? You can imagine then that a person that has only developed the use of their reptilian brain, right, that this person's life will tend to be characterized by a preoccupation with just these things, right? Right? Food, sex, money, bodily comfort, sleep. It is the animal brain. And you can see in people who brains did not fully develop in the process are really stuck at the animal level, fundamentally. And they live like animals, right? They have all the interests of an animal. After the heart, which is the principal initiator of the process that brings us into being, develop the R complex. Once that matures, and that's usually by the age of 1, incidentally, that structure is complete. Then they start building the next one, which is the limbic, right? Are you with me? We got brain stem. Now we're getting the limbic. What are the kinds of actions associated with the limbic system? What do that normally? Huh? Not reason. Yeah, emotions, emotional centers. All right. Particularly in the temporal lobe area, right? The amygdala, right? And all of that, the thalamus and blah, 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 blah. But it is that center of the brain, right, that normally drives our emotional responses, all right? Interesting thing is that the heart the heart itself has a direct input into here, because the heart has built this thing, right? This has emerged out of the heart. So here at the medulla, right, the heart sends its influences right up through the medulla, through this, up to here, right? And fire it up. Interesting. Now we're going to talk a lot more, and I'm going to open it up for a little discussion here, because this gets really, really hairy here. So I just don't want to blab, 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 blab. So I want to open it up, and that way I can fill in where you're really stuck at and not just waste language and time. I'm just trying to give you the process. After the limbic complex is completed, then of course the neocortex, the new brain, the latest brain that evolution has given us, right? You see? Now you got your central nervous system and all of that stuff ready to go, ready to operate. And you got it by 4. When a child is born, there's 100 billion neurons already in place. It's way out. We are magnificent things, folks. You see? I mean, we are magnificent, just physically speaking. All right. Now, here's where it gets very interesting. You all know about the central nervous system, right? What is one of the other kinds of nervous system that is, right, the autonomic nervous system, right? Consisting of the sympathetic, parasympathetic, right? Now here's where it gets real interesting, folks. First of all, the heart influences this system directly through the limbic system. Okay. Other thing that you're going to find out, where there's stress, guess where there's an imbalance? An autonomic nervous system, right? And what there is the imbalance is precisely a overactivity of the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. Are you with me? What does the sympathetic part of the autonomic system do? What is associated with that? Well, constrictions and all of those things, right? It constricts all of the systems on it. It the pupil of the eyes dilate and all of that. It constricts, right? This is the part of the nervous system that empowers, right? Adrenaline, blah, blah, blah. This is when you are in a state of anger. Where's the imbalance? Anger means you're way over here, which means that the system is optimum level, right? And that is what leads to all of the kinds of symptoms associated with being in an angry condition, because you have upset the balance, right, of the sympathetic and parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, okay? And what the researchers showed us is that the heart itself directly influences how this works. Right now, you're not going to probably get what all this has to do with the development of emotional self-management skills. Hopefully that'll become clear as we go along here today. But you have to have a little bit of a foundation here. So I don't intend, and I don't mean to give you a lecture and all of this, but there's just some things that you have to understand a little bit. Now, if you got that so far, and of course, feel free to ask me any questions as we go along, because now I got to build on that, okay? So if you got any questions, don't be shy about it, folks. You just open up, and we'll proceed. Now, the 80s were an interesting time, because a lot of stuff was going on. One of the other things that occurred about 1980 was the publishing of physics by David Bohm of a book called Wholeness in the Implicate Order. Anybody familiar with that book? Dayo Saab, you read Wholeness in the Implicate Order? Anybody understand anything about the implicate order and the explicate order? I might as well go home, man. No, I'm only teasing you. It's a lot of hidden knowledge from us. All right. All right, here's what David Bohm, Nobel physicist, discovered and published, that there is a energy out of which everything emerges. Now, those of you in the house, you are at home, right? What I'm trying to do is to make our conversation a little bit accessible to people who have not had the benefit of studying Spanda and that whole phenomena, right? So you all also must bear with me. It's a very difficult thing to try to keep you both here. That there is I'll give you a review, huh? There is a kind of energy, a kind of process out of which everything comes into being. This is called the implicate order. Meaning that everything that comes into your experience and existing comes out of a potential state. It's a potentia. And the explicate order is that which becomes manifest. Now, a little later, David Bohm thought some more about it, and he was able to tease out of there a little bit more insight. What he discovered that, well, it was just more than these two, and it's going to get better from here. This is going to be the hardest part, I promise you. He found that there is a kind of super implicate order. That provides the field that generates the implicate order, which in turn produces the explicate order. And he even looked further, he found that there's one beyond it, and he called it simply insight and intelligence. What he's really saying is that everything that you see in creation has emerged out of this kind of thing called intelligence. That intelligence is the source and the mechanism and the process by which things has come into being. That this universe is the result of a profound, inscrutable intelligence. You can just look at the physical body and see that, can't you? A kind of what I simply have called supreme intelligence. So this field of supreme intelligence, right, give rise to the super implicate order, a realm of possibilities that are infinite. And out of that infinite realm of possibilities and so forth, it comes down to the implicate, and you all are following this? It steps it down. This is more difficult than I thought. Now, I'm saying a lot here. Now I want to show you how this same model that comes out of physics is reflected in the relationship between the heart brain and the cranial brain. Are you okay? Now, this is what neurocardiology is finding out now. Okay? Here's their model. You have the heart, the intelligence of the heart. That now creates the brain, of course, right? It's giving us that. And you have the neocortex that sits at the top of that pyramid, right? Then you have the limbic, and then finally you have the R complex. Is that right? What it is really saying, folks, is that the brain translates the energy of this absolute intelligence and give rise to human experience, depending upon the condition of your brain, its development. The physical heart translates the intelligence. Is any of this making sense to you all? Have I lost you too much here? Go ahead, Ronnie.
I was just going to say, just gave the last example. I lined that up with creation.
With what?
Creation. That's
Creation.
That's the story of creation.
Yeah.
Your inside intelligence is God. Your super implicate order is God's will. The implicate order is the word. And the explicate order is the world.
The world.
And this is what you're doing again.
Yes, I'm trying to build that same model and try to show how this model is reflected even at the physical, that it goes on everywhere, right? That this process is holographic. Right? Meaning that the macro shows up in the micro. You see, it's a reflection. That you can take a piece, it's like in a normal hologram. You got a hologram picture, you can cut it into 1,000 pieces, take one piece, shoot some laser through it, it'll reproduce the whole image, right? And your mind is holographic, incidentally. That's how you have in the experience of the self. The experience of your sense of self is holographic. Why? Because you have this sense of self. You do have a sense of self, don't you? You're not that bad off, are you? What about you, Tim? You got a sense of self? All right. Now, this sense of self you experience is unchanging. The me that you feel you are seems to be unchanging. Although the structure of the me, and when I say structure, I mean body, right? Because your body is renewing cells, killing cells, right? You don't have the same body that you have when you were a 3-year-old me, do you? So all them cells gone, right? The body completely, in the course of a few years, cellularly speaking, is an entirely different creature. But nevertheless, it organizes in a pattern, right? The new material that mimics the same pattern of the me. All right, let me tell you, like in art, how many artists in here? There was a school of art where one painter used it for faces. I'm not an artist, so this is horrible here. But you can imagine somebody draw a face of somebody, right? But they will make the face out of fruit. You know, they would use pieces of fruit to make a face, but it would look like the person. Are you with me? Right. You understand cubism and so forth and so on? Right? And then they will draw another portrait and use an entirely different set of fruit. but it will still be the same image of the person. Are you with me?
Right.
Are you with me? Huh? Using different elements, but you're organizing those elements in a way that they produces the same ultimate image. Are you with me? Well, that is what is really happening to you. You got different cells and all of this here. You're older, you know what I mean? A few pounds heavier and all of that. But you still feel unchanged at the level of your me, because your me organizes all of that. Anybody familiar with the Santiago theory of cognition? No? I can't use that one. All right. The Santiago theory of cognition was, again, one of those 80s phenomena down in Chile this time, and some Hispanic brothers, Humberto Mutarana and Varela, came up with an extraordinary insight. They understood that there was a relationship between mind and structure. Or process and product. What they discovered was that the process remains unchanged. It can always produce another product, right? But the process itself does not change. And not only that, the process is always reflected in the product. You see? And they call this structural coupling. That's the concept. So this stuff is a little difficult. Folks, you have to understand, we're talking about intelligence now. So when we start talking about the wisdom of the heart, you're going to just have to expect some of this here. Because one of the things they talk about, the mystics talk about, is that you can't develop your intellect. Well, you have to develop your intellect, rather, to a very significant degree in order for it to now be able to translate intelligence. Are you with me? The intellect in the neocortex, that whole process is simple. Its only function is to translate intelligence.